Thursday night, 11:47 p.m., South Street subway station. Beneath the rain-soaked streets of New York City. Julian. Clara screamed as the subway doors slammed shut between them. The warning bell shrieked. Metal wheels screamed against the tracks. Julian's blood-stained fist struck the glass while his face twisted with helpless rage. Then Clara's expression changed. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. A massive hand clamped over her mouth from inside the crowded train. Clara, Julian roared, raising his gun as the carriage began disappearing into the black tunnel. The stranger dragged her backward, his face hidden behind the terrified passengers. Clara fought desperately, never taking her eyes off Julian. But just before darkness swallowed the train, the kidnapper leaned close to her ear and whispered, "Your sister is next." The train vanished. And for the first time, the city's most feared mafia boss looked completely terrified. How far will Julian Vance go to save the woman who uncovered the betrayal inside his own empire? Stay with us until the end and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this story. The tailor's chalk scratched against the charcoal wool. It was a dry, irritating sound. Julian Vance stood perfectly still on the velvet pedestal. He stared straight ahead into the gilded mirror. The reflection belonged to a man who had successfully sanitized his own brutality. The suit was cut tight, tailored close to the ribs to hide the bulk of the leather shoulder holster he refused to take off, even for his wedding fitting. "You're breathing too heavily." Julian. Victoria didn't look up from her phone. She sat on the plush leather sofa behind him, her thumbs tapped rhythmically against the glass screen. She was firing off demands to people whose names she would never bother to remember. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She was beautiful, but she was beautiful in the way a freshly forged knife was beautiful. Sharp, cold, completely unyielding. "My mother thinks the hydrangeas look too cheap," Victoria said. "I told her we are merging the Sterling distribution lines with the Vance ports. We aren't throwing a carnival. White, silver, black, that's the palette. Whatever you want, Victoria," Julian said. His voice was flat. It was a transaction, a contract sealed in imported silk and 300 high society guests. He didn't love her, she didn't love him. They understood each other perfectly. That was exactly why this arrangement was supposed to work. Power recognized power. Julian stepped off the pedestal. He tossed the unfinished $5,000 jacket onto a velvet chair. He didn't care about the price tag. He didn't care about the flowers. He just wanted the merger done. Outside the boutique, the city was moving. But inside Julian's corporate empire, there was only one person who actually kept the wheels turning. Clara Hayes. Clara had been his assistant for 4 years. She was the buffer between his violent, chaotic reality and the sterile corporate front he maintained for the feds. She knew he took his coffee black and burning hot. She knew exactly how much cash to slip to the beat cops in the Harbor District. She was a ghost in the machine, a woman of unremarkable height, practical shoes, and an unnerving lack of intimidation. Julian ruled by fear, Clara ruled by competence. Back at the penthouse office, Clara sat at her desk. The glow of dual monitors illuminated her pale face. She was typing. Fast. Julian walked past her desk without stopping. "The shipment at Pier 4. He tossed the words over his shoulder. "A loader got crushed under a crate. Compound fracture. Security says he's threatening to sue." "His name is David," Clara said quietly. She didn't stop typing. "He has 3 kids. Julian paused at his office door. He looked back at her. "I don't care if he has 10 kids, Clara. He's a liability. Give him a month's severance and have legal bury him in paperwork. We don't fund mistakes." Julian walked into his office and shut the door. Clara stopped typing. She stared at the closed mahogany door, her jaw tightened. Julian Vance saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet, assets or liabilities, nothing in between. But Clara knew the truth. A business built on crushing its own people was just a graveyard waiting to happen. She opened the payroll framework. She didn't draft the severance package. Instead, she routed a blind bonus through a shell company. Enough to cover David's medical bills for a year. Full paid leave. She coded it under a generic equipment maintenance expense. She wasn't going to let a man lose his home just because a billionaire didn't want to look at a hospital bill. People deserved dignity, even in the dark, especially in the dark. Clara took a breath and switched to the next task. The wedding accounts. Victoria's family had insisted on handling the catering. Julian had approved a $2 million budget for the rehearsal and reception. It was absurd, but it was the cost of doing business. Clara pulled up the routing numbers. Her eyes narrowed. The money wasn't going to a hospitality group in the city. It was being chopped up, routed into 7 different offshore accounts. Cayman Islands, Cyprus. Clara leaned closer to the screen. Her heart gave a sudden hard thump against her ribs. These weren't caterers. These were shell accounts tied to independent mercenary outfits. Victoria's father wasn't buying truffles and wild mushrooms. He was buying a private army, and Julian was footing the bill. She clicked on a transaction dated Tuesday morning. An attached file she hit download. A blueprint filled the screen. It was the Vance shipping warehouse on Pier 4. Red markers highlighted the structural weak points, the blind spots in the security cameras, the exact shift rotations of Julian's personal detail. It was a hit. The wedding was a Trojan horse. The Sterlings were going to slaughter Julian and take the ports. Clara's hands started to shake. She reached for the print command. She needed physical proof. If she walked into Julian's office with just a theory, he would think she was trying to sabotage the merger. She needed the paper. She hit print. Nothing happened. The screen flickered. The blueprint vanished, replaced by a solid black screen. A small red padlock icon pulsed in the center. Her terminal was locked. Someone was watching the network. Someone knew she was looking. Claire grabbed her bag. She didn't have time to explain. She dropped to her knees, pulled a hidden key taped under her desk, and opened the heavy fireproof safe hidden behind the filing cabinets. She grabbed the Syndicate Master physical ledger, the only thing keeping Julian out of federal prison, the only leverage they had left. She shoved it into her bag and ran for the service elevator. 2 days later, Thursday morning, the sky above the city was a bruised, ugly purple. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office. Julian walked off the private elevator. He was already irritated. His head throbbed. He expected the smell of black coffee. He expected a neat stack of briefings. He expected Clara to tell him exactly how the day was going to run. The reception area was dead silent. Julian stopped. He looked at Clara's desk. The monitors were black. Her chair was pushed back. Her favorite pen was lying carelessly on the floor. "Clara," Julian called out. No answer, just the sound of the rain against the glass. He walked around the desk. His eyes scanned the pristine surface. Then he looked down. The false paneling at the bottom of the wall was kicked open. The heavy steel door of the hidden safe was hanging wide on its hinges. Empty, the master ledger was gone. The encryption keys were gone. Julian froze. The silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. His pulse kicked hard against his throat. A cold, ugly feeling twisted in his stomach. His flawless assistant hadn't checked in for 48 hours. The wedding was in 2 days. And the most dangerous book in the city was missing. Julian Vance didn't trust loose ends. And right now, the woman who held his entire life in her hands had just become the biggest loose end of all. He turned on his heel. He wasn't going to send his men to find her. He was going to hunt her down himself. The rain beat against the armored glass of the SUV. It was a heavy, relentless downpour. The kind that washed the grime off the city streets but left the underlying rot completely untouched. Julian Vance stared out the window. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. "Where are we going, boss?" Liam asked from the driver's seat. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror. He could feel the tension radiating off Julian like heat from a furnace. "Southside," Julian said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "Garrison Street." Liam hesitated. His hands tightened on the leather steering wheel. "Boss, that's deep in the slums. It's no man's land. We don't have detail down there." "Drive the car, Liam." The heavy vehicle cut through the slick streets. The transition was jarring. Within 20 minutes, the towering glass monoliths of the financial district vanished. They were replaced by crumbling brick facades, rusted fire escapes, streetlights that had been shot out and never replaced. Julian looked at his phone. The address glowing on the screen made no sense. He paid Clara a salary that should have afforded her a luxury high-rise downtown. She should have had a doorman. A lobby that smelled of fresh lilies. Instead, the GPS dot dragged them deeper into a decaying artery of the city. This was a place where people didn't live. They just survived. Why was she here? Julian thought back to Tuesday. The last time he saw her, she had looked tired. Her skin was usually a healthy, pale cream, but that afternoon, it had a grayish, exhausted tint. He remembered seeing a faint bruise on her jawline. She had covered it poorly with cheap makeup. He had asked her about it. She blamed a cabinet door. He had accepted the lie. He accepted it because he had a multi-million-dollar wedding to plan. Because her personal life was an inconvenience to his schedule. A sharp twist of self-disgust hit him. It sat heavy in his stomach. He was a man who prided himself on seeing everything, on knowing every angle, but he had looked right past the woman keeping his empire from collapsing. "Pull over," Julian ordered. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of a 4-story brick building. It looked like it was slouching against the adjacent structures just to stay upright. The front door was a sheet of warped plywood. "Keep the engine running," Julian said. He stepped out into the freezing rain. The cold water immediately soaked the shoulders of his bespoke coat. He didn't care. He walked with deliberate, heavy steps toward the entrance. He pushed the plywood door open. The hinges screamed. The smell hit him instantly. It was a suffocating cocktail of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap bleach. It was the smell of desperation. The hallway was narrow. The walls were painted a sickly institutional green. The paint was peeling away in long, dry strips. A single fluorescent tube flickered on the ceiling. It buzzed like an angry hornet. Julian's hand instinctively brushed the lapel of his coat. He felt the hard, comforting outline of his Glock. He moved up the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under his weight. He passed the second floor, then the third. The sounds of life bled through the thin walls. A baby crying relentlessly. A muffled argument over rent money. A television blaring a game show. This was a world of raw, unpolished survival. It was the exact opposite of the pristine, sanitized world he had built for himself. The exact opposite of the world Victoria Sterling inhabited. He reached the 4th floor, apartment 4B. Julian stopped. The door was heavy oak. It looked entirely out of place in this dilapidated building, but it wasn't secure. The wood around the deadbolt was violently splintered. The brass lock casing was shattered. Someone had kicked it in. Recently, Julian drew his weapon in one fluid motion. He didn't breathe. He pushed the door open. It swung inward with a slow, agonizing creak. He stepped inside. He swept the room with the barrel of the gun. The apartment was freezing. There was no heat. The shades were pulled down over the single window, casting the room in a heavy gray twilight. Julian lowered the gun slightly. His brow furrowed. There was no furniture. None. The living room was an empty expanse of scuffed hardwood floor, no couch, no television. No rugs. The only object in the room was a cheap plastic folding table pushed against the far wall. "Clara," Julian called out. His voice sounded too loud. Harsh and intrusive in the hollow space, no answer. Only the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. He moved further into the apartment. He checked the tiny galley kitchen. The refrigerator was unplugged. The door hung open to reveal empty wire shelves. Then he looked down the short hallway. Heat smears of dark. Rusty brown stained the cheap linoleum floor. They weren't splatters, they were drags. The wide, desperate drag marks of someone who couldn't lift their own weight. And then the smell registered. It cut straight through the damp cold of the apartment. It was sharp, heavy, unmistakable to a man who had built an empire on violence. The scent of fresh copper. Julian's pulse kicked into a violent rhythm. He followed the trail of blood. It led straight to the half-open bathroom door. Julian pushed the bathroom door wide open. The space was illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging above a chipped porcelain sink. Clara was on the floor. She was wedged in the narrow space between the bathtub and the toilet. She wasn't dead, but she looked like she was actively dying. She wore an oversized gray t-shirt. It was completely soaked through with sweat and blossoming stains of dark red. Her bare legs were splayed out in front of her. A thick, bloody towel was wadded up and pressed hard against her left thigh. Her head lolled to the side against the tub. Her skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and stretched tight over the bones of her face. The bruise he had seen on Tuesday was now a massive, ugly sprawl of purple covering half her cheek. Her lower lip was split. She wasn't holding his ledger. She wasn't holding a phone to call the feds. She was holding a curved needle. It was threaded with thick, cheap black nylon. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't find the grip to push it through her own torn skin. Julian froze. He had watched men die. He had ordered executions without his heart rate spiking, but the sight of his quiet, brilliant assistant trying to stitch up her own butcher wound in a freezing, empty bathroom felt like a physical blow to his chest. He dropped his gun. It clattered loudly onto the tile. Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes were usually sharp and observant. Now they were glassy and unfocused with fever. She stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out for help. She just let out a dry, rattling breath. "You're tracking mud on the floor, Julian," she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. Julian fell to his knees beside her. He didn't care about the blood soaking into his tailored trousers. He reached out. His large hands hovered over her for a second before he gripped her wrists. He gently but firmly pried the bloody needle from her trembling fingers. "What happened?" he demanded. His voice was too harsh, too loud. He didn't want to sound angry, but the panic rising in his chest had nowhere else to go. "Don't yell," Clara whispered. She closed her eyes. "I have a headache, Clara. Look at me." Julian grabbed her chin. He tilted her face up. Her skin was burning hot. A massive infection was already racing through her bloodstream. "Who did this?" She let out a weak, humorless laugh. It ended in a cough. "Victoria's men, 2 of them. They wanted the ledger." Julian's blood went cold. "Victoria Wedding is a hostile takeover." Julian Clara panted. Her hands gripped the edge of the bathtub until her knuckles turned white. "Her father is bringing in a private army. They're going to hit the Pier 4 armory during the rehearsal dinner. I found the offshore accounts. I printed the proof." She gestured weakly to her leg. "They tried to hamstring me so I couldn't run. But I got away. The ledger is safe." Julian stared at her. He thought of Victoria sitting in the boutique, complaining about the hydrangeas while she planned his funeral. Then he looked at Clara, living in a freezing box, bleeding out on cheap linoleum, protecting his life. "Why didn't you call an ambulance?" Julian snarled. He grabbed a clean section of the towel and pressed it hard against her wound. Clara flinched. A sharp hiss escaped her teeth. "Why didn't you go to the ER?" Julian pushed. "I pay you enough to live in a fortress. Why are you living in this slum?" Clara opened her eyes. The fever was heavy, but her fierce, cynical intelligence cut straight through the haze. She looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and pity. "Because healthcare in this country is a luxury." "Julian," she choked out, "and anonymity is expensive." Julian frowned. "What are you talking about?" "My sister," Clara whispered. Her head rolled back against the wall. "Maya, she has a degenerative lung disease. She's on a ventilator at St. Jude's. It costs $10,000 a month just to keep the machine running. I put every dime you pay me into a blind trust to keep her alive." Julian felt a knot form in his throat. "It was tight and hard. If I go to an emergency room," Clara continued, her voice fading. "They scanned my ID. My name gets flagged in the public registry. Victoria's men are watching the hospitals. They find me, they find Maya, and they drain the trust. I am not letting my sister suffocate because I got careless with a knife." Julian stopped breathing. She had absorbed the physical agony of a butcher's blade. She was trying to sew her own flesh together in the dark, all to protect an innocent girl from a broken system, and to protect Julian from his own blind arrogance. He had hoarded wealth. He bought $5,000 suits. And the woman keeping his empire intact was starving herself to pay for oxygen. "Hold still," Julian commanded. His voice dropped to a low, rough rumble. He shoved his bespoke suit jacket off. He rolled up his sleeves. He didn't ask permission. He poured rubbing alcohol directly over the jagged slice in her thigh. Clara's back arched, a strangled, guttural sound tore from her throat. She bit down on her own shoulder to keep from screaming. Her body trembled violently under his hands. Julian's jaw locked. He felt every tremor passing through her. He threaded the needle with steady, mechanical precision. Every puncture of the needle through her pale skin felt like a direct indictment of his own blindness. From the empty living room, a sharp, intrusive sound shattered the quiet. Julian's burner phone. He tied off the stitch. He clipped the thread with tiny, rusted scissors. He didn't move. He just looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Her chest was rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. "Answer it," she whispered. "It's her. She'll be asking about the seating chart." Julian reached into his pocket. He pulled out the phone. The screen glared brightly in the dim bathroom. Victoria's name illuminated the dark. He hit accept. He brought the phone to his ear, but he kept his eyes locked on Clara, where Victoria's voice was tiny, sharp and impatient. "The caterer is threatening to walk if we don't finalize the truffle risotto." Julian stared at the blood on his hands. It was sticky, drying into the creases of his knuckles. "Victoria," Julian said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "What? And don't use that tone with me. I am trying to hold this event together. Listen to me carefully," Julian said. He watched Clara's heavy eyelids flutter as the fever pulled at her. "There is no risotto. There is no rehearsal dinner. The wedding is cancelled." Silence on the other end of the line. A long, stretching void. "Excuse me," Victoria finally hissed. The polished facade cracked. "You cannot cancel this wedding. Julian, do you understand what my father will do?" "It's a hostile takeover," Julian corrected softly. "And your father is going to find out very shortly that the Vance ports are closed to him. Tell him the men he sent on Tuesday were sloppy. Julian, tell him my assistant sends her regards. If I see your father in my city by nightfall, I will sink him in the harbor." "Run, Victoria." He didn't wait for her response. He crushed the phone in his hand. The cheap plastic screen spiderwebbed and cracked under his grip. He tossed it into the dry bathtub. He turned his attention back to Clara. She was smiling. It was a terrible, bloody, exhausted smile, but it was genuine. "You ruined your suit," she murmured. Her eyes finally slid shut. "I hated the suit," Julian said. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He ignored her weak groan of protest. He lifted her off the cold linoleum. She weighed nothing. It enraged him all over again. How little space she took up. How easily she carried the weight of his world while starving herself of her own. "Where are we going?" she mumbled. Her head fell against his chest. "To my safe house," Julian said. He carried her out of the bathroom, past the empty, freezing living room, out the splintered wooden door. "And then you are going to help me tear the Sterling Syndicate down to the studs." The ride to the safe house was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The black SUV tore through the slick streets. Liam took the corners with a reckless speed that threw Clara's unconscious body against Julian's chest. Julian didn't adjust her. He just clamped his arm tighter around her shoulders. The heavy iron gates of his private compound parted. Liam slammed the brakes outside the front portico. "Get Victor," Julian snapped. He kicked his door open. "I want him in the medical wing 3 minutes ago." Liam sprinted toward the security annex. Julian carried Clara through the cavernous foyer of the safe house. His boots left dark, muddy prints across the pristine marble. The sterile perfection of the house made him sick to his stomach. It felt dead. He hauled her into the medical suite. He deposited her onto the center of a sterile, white hospital bed. The sheets instantly began to absorb the dark red fluid seeping from her hastily bandaged thigh. Victor, the syndicate's private physician, arrived breathless 2 minutes later. He dropped his heavy leather medical bag onto a steel tray. "Julian," what Victor started. He stopped dead at the foot of the bed. He took in the dirt, the bruises, and the emaciated woman lying on the mattress. "Is that Miss Hayes? Fix her," Julian ordered. He backed away from the bed. His hands hung uselessly at his sides. The adrenaline was receding. It left a cold, jagged hollow in his chest. Victor didn't ask questions. He snapped on a pair of latex gloves and went to work. Julian stood by the wall. He listened to the rain hammer against the reinforced glass. He refused to look away. He forced himself to watch as Victor cut away the blood-soaked t-shirt. "Her core temperature is 103, Victor muttered. He hooked a bag of clear fluid to an IV pole. He expertly found a vein in the crook of her elbow. "Severe dehydration, exhaustion. The wound is nasty. Whoever did this twisted the blade before they pulled it out." Victor began flushing the wound with a harsh, chemical-smelling antiseptic. Clara didn't twitch. She was completely under. "Julian," Victor said quietly. "When was the last time she ate? Her immune system is completely depleted. It's like she's been running on fumes for a year." The words felt like a physical strike. Julian looked at Clara's collarbones. They were sharp and protruding beneath the harsh overhead light. He thought about the catered lunches he expensed to his office, the heavy, rich meals he ate while she sat at her desk, quietly organizing his empire. He had never once asked if she had eaten. He assumed his money insulated her from hardship. He had assumed wrong. "Pump her full of whatever antibiotics you have," Julian said. His voice was flat, devoid of the tremor he felt in his hands. "If she needs a transfusion, take it from me. I'm O-negative." Victor paused. The doctor's eyes were sharp, evaluating. Julian Vance did not bleed for his employees. He bled his enemies. But Victor merely nodded. "I'll stabilize her, but she needs rest." Real rest. An hour later, Victor left the room to process the blood work. The medical suite was silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Julian walked over to a steel sink in the corner. He turned on the hot water. He scrubbed the dried blood and grease off his hands with a stiff bristle brush. He watched the pink-tinged water swirl down the drain. He dried his hands on a towel. Then he walked back to the bed. He pulled a clean chair up next to the mattress. He sat down. He looked at Clara's hands resting on the blanket. Her knuckles were bruised. There was dried blood beneath her fingernails from gripping the bathroom tiles. Julian reached out. He took a warm, damp cloth from a medical basin, gently, with a meticulous care he didn't know he possessed. He began wiping the dried blood away from her fingers. He cleaned her palms. He wiped away the grime from her wrists. It was a silent act of penance. A physical acknowledgement of the blood she had spilled to keep him breathing. Clara shifted on the bed. A soft groan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered. She opened her eyes. Squinting against the bright fluorescent lights, she looked at the IV line in her arm. She looked at the clean white bandages on her leg. Then she looked at Julian. He froze, the damp cloth still in his hand. Clara didn't panic. She didn't shrink back. She pulled her hand away from his grip. It was a weak motion, but the intent was absolute. "You're awake," Julian said softly. "Where am I?" she rasped. Her throat was incredibly dry. "My safe house. Victor stitched you up properly. The infection is receding." Julian reached for a plastic cup of water on the bedside table. He held out the straw to her lips. Clara took a slow sip. She swallowed hard. She leaned her head back against the pillows. "I brought the ledger," she whispered. "It's in my bag," Julian said. "I secured it." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. The corporate mask was gone. His tailored shirt was ruined. His hair was a mess. He looked human. "I am not your property, Julian," Clara said suddenly. Her voice lacked volume, but it carried the weight of iron. Julian went perfectly still. "I work for you," she continued, her breathing shallow. "I manage your accounts. I protect your assets. But you do not get to kick down my door, drag me out of my home, and dictate my life. I am a person, not an asset on your spreadsheet." Julian set the water cup down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor between his boots. He didn't argue. He didn't assert his dominance. "I failed you," Julian said. The words hung in the sterile air, a confession from a king to his soldier. "I hoarded power," Julian continued, his voice rough. "I bought politicians and private jets. And I let the woman keeping me alive stitch herself up with sewing thread because I was too arrogant to see her reality. I treated you like a machine. I was wrong." Claire stared at him. The pragmatic walls she had built around herself wavered slightly. She expected a tyrant. She got an apology. "My sister," Clara started. "Maya is safe," Julian interrupted gently. "I have two of my best men outside her room at St. Jude's. The hospital has been notified that her medical trust is fully backed by the Vance estate. She will never be taken off that machine until she walks out of there on her own 2 feet. That is not a transaction. Clara, that is a debt I owe you." Clara's lower lip trembled. She bit down on it, fighting the sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. She had carried the crushing weight of her sister's life alone for so long. Having someone else shoulder it felt terrifying and entirely liberating. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She pushed the emotion down. There was still a war to win. "Bring me a laptop," Clara ordered. Her voice found its professional edge again. "You need to sleep," Julian countered. "I need to decrypt the ledger. Victoria's father thinks he's hitting the armory tomorrow night. If we pull the routing numbers now, we can present the proof to the Syndicate Council. We can strip the Sterlings of their territory legally. No war, just an execution." Julian looked at her fierce, unyielding eyes. He nodded. He walked to the desk across the room and booted up a secure terminal. He brought it over, resting it gently on the tray table across her lap. Clara's fingers flew across the keyboard. The movement was slightly uncoordinated from the painkillers, but her muscle memory was flawless. She bypassed the first firewall. She cracked the second, lines of code reflected in her dark eyes. "I'm in," she said. "I have the Sterling offshore drops. I have the mercenary contracts. Print them." Julian said, a cold, predatory smile touching his lips. "We present them to the council tonight." Suddenly the room was bathed in a violent, flashing red light. The high-pitched scream of the perimeter breach alarm shattered the silence. Julian spun toward the reinforced window. The heavy steel security shutters slammed down automatically, sealing the room in darkness illuminated only by the strobing red emergency lights. "Julian," Clara said. Her voice was tight with sudden panic. Julian drew his Glock. He racked the slide. He looked at the security monitors mounted on the wall. The front gates of the compound had been blown off their hinges. 3 armored tactical vehicles poured into the courtyard, but it wasn't Victoria's men. The men spilling out of the trucks wore matte black tactical gear. On their shoulders was a silver emblem, a crossed sword and a shield, the insignia of the Syndicate's elite guard. "They aren't Sterlings," Julian whispered. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the cold logic of a master tactician instantly falling into place. The Syndicate Council wasn't coming to listen to his proof. They were coming to kill him. The strobing red lights painted the medical suite in blood. Julian stared at the security monitors. The elite guard, the Syndicate's absolute highest tier of enforcers. They only moved on a direct vote from the council. They were the executioners of the Empire. And they were here for him, Julian, Clara said. Her voice was tight. The heavy painkillers were fighting a losing battle against pure adrenaline. Julian didn't answer. He watched the screens. 3 tactical teams were already stacking up against the reinforced front doors. Heavy breaching charges were being rigged to the steel frames. The logic clicked. It was cold. It was devastating. Victoria didn't just plan a takeover, Julian whispered. He didn't look away from the monitors. She couldn't call the elite guard. Only a council member can do that. Clara swung her good leg over the edge of the bed. She grabbed the metal rail to steady herself. The offshore accounts, the ones I found, they weren't just funding mercenaries. They were structured to look like embezzling. Julian turned to her. The pieces fell together into a horrifying picture. The pension fund, Julian said. His voice was hollow, the syndicate's emergency reserves. Someone drained them. They routed the money through Victoria's caterers and pinned it on me. They used the cancelled wedding as proof that I was cutting and running. Who? Clara asked us. Julian said. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. My adoptive father, he mentored me. He handed me this empire. And now he's taking it back. A deafening explosion rocked the safe house. The floor vibrated. Dust rained down from the ceiling tiles. The heavy steel front doors on the ground floor blew inward. Smoke poured into the foyer. Heavily armed men flooded the perimeter. Julian raised his Glock. It was a useless gesture. He had 15 rounds. There were 30 men downstairs wearing Kevlar. We can't shoot our way out of this, Julian said. He backed away from the door. He looked at Clara. I need to get you out. I am not running while you die in a hallway. Clara snapped. She didn't wait for him to argue. She grabbed the laptop from the tray table. She balanced it on her knee. Her fingers hammered the keys. What are you doing? I built the network grid for this house, Clara said. Her eyes were locked on the screen. You wanted a fortress, I gave you one. But I also built the traps. On the monitor, the elite guard split into 2 teams. One headed for the armory. The other stacked up at the base of the East Wing stairwell. The stairwell leading directly to the medical suite. Julian moved to the doorway. He checked his sightline. They're coming up. Let them, Clara said. She tapped the enter key. Heavy titanium fire doors slammed down at the top and bottom of the East Wing stairwell. The grinding screech of metal on metal echoed through the compound. The tactical team was trapped inside the concrete chute. HVAC override, Clara muttered. She typed another command, cutting oxygen flow to the stairwell, pumping in the halon fire suppression gas. They won't die, but they'll be unconscious in 60 seconds. Julian looked at her. He was a man who saw problems with bullets. He was watching a woman solve an impossible tactical nightmare with keystrokes. It was the most brilliant thing he had ever seen. The sub-basement, Clara said. She slammed the laptop shut. There's an old Prohibition tunnel. It connects to the city subway grid. It's not on any of Marcus's blueprints. Julian didn't waste time. He slung his arm around her waist. He hauled her to her feet. She hissed in pain, her bad leg buckling. But she caught herself against his chest. I've got you, Julian said. They moved out of the medical suite. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of cordite from the breached front doors. Julian carried most of Clara's weight. They bypassed the main corridors. They took the servant stairs down into the dark, echoing basement. Julian kicked open the rusted iron door hiding the tunnel. It was pitch black. It smelled of mildew and ancient brick. Julian clicked on a small tactical flashlight. The beam cut through the dust. They moved fast. Every step was agony for Clara. Her breathing was ragged, but she didn't complain. She didn't ask to stop. You don't deserve this, Julian said softly. His voice echoed off the curved brick ceiling. Deserve has nothing to do with it. Clara gasped. Power doesn't care who deserves to live. It just takes. We have to be smarter than the power. It was a simple truth. Julian had spent his whole life being the power. Now he was the prey. It was a brutal, necessary education. The tunnel began to slope upward. The low vibrating rumble of a train shook the dirt beneath their boots. They reached the end of the tunnel. A heavy metal grate blocked their path. Julian kicked it outward. It clattered onto the concrete platform of the South Street subway station. The station was crowded: commuters, students, people coming off the late shift, normal people living normal lives. Julian and Clara climbed out of the maintenance shaft. They blended into the edge of the crowd. Julian kept his arm tight around Clara. Her head was tucked into his shoulder. To a passing glance, they looked like a couple coming home from a rough night out. "We need a burner phone," Julian whispered against her hair. "We call Liam, we regroup." "Look out," someone screamed. Panic erupted on the platform. At the far end of the station, 3 men in dark suits pushed through the turnstiles. They didn't care about blending in. They drew their weapons. The crowd panicked. People screamed and scattered, dropping bags and coffee cups. It was Victoria's men. Julian snarled. He shoved Clara behind a thick concrete pillar. He drew his Glock. He fired 2 shots. One man dropped, a bullet shattering his kneecap. The crowd screamed louder. The stampede intensified. The screech of metal on metal deafened them. A southbound train roared into the station. The doors slid open. "Get on the train," Julian yelled. He provided cover fire. He pushed Clara toward the open doors. She stumbled, her bad leg giving out. Julian caught her. He shoved her into the crowded subway car. He turned back to fire one last suppressing shot. A wall of panicked commuters slammed into him. They were fleeing the gunfire. Julian was shoved backward, pinned against the outside of the train car. He fought against the tide of bodies. He reached for the open doors. The automated warning chime sounded. Clara screamed from inside the car. He locked eyes with her. He lunged forward. The heavy metal doors slammed shut. They caught Julian's arm. He wrenched it free, cursing loudly. He slammed his fist against the reinforced glass. Clara was looking at him through the window, but she wasn't looking at his face. Her eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She was looking at something behind him. No, not behind him, behind her, inside the train car. A massive hand clamped over Clara's mouth. A man in a dark suit dragged her backward into the crowd of screaming passengers. The train lurched forward. Julian stood on the platform. The gun hung useless in his hand. He watched the train accelerate into the dark tunnel, taking the only thing in the world he actually cared about straight into the abyss. The warehouse smelled of rotting kelp and diesel fuel. It was freezing. The damp cold seeped through the concrete floor and settled deep into the bones. Clara sat in a heavy wooden chair in the center of the empty room. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back. The rough plastic cut into her wrists. Her injured leg throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic pulse. The bandages were soaked through again. She was completely alone in the dark for what felt like hours. Then, the heavy metal door rolled up. Light spilled into the warehouse. Footsteps echoed against the concrete. The sharp, rhythmic click of expensive heels. Victoria Sterling walked into the light. She wore a tailored white cashmere coat. It was pristine, completely untouched by the rain or the violence of the night. 2 massive enforcers flanked her, carrying suppressed rifles. Victoria stopped a few feet from the chair. She looked down at Clara. Her lips curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. "Look at you," Victoria said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of empathy, a secretary, sitting in a puddle of her own blood. "I suppose this is where people like you belong." Clara didn't look down. She kept her chin up. Her eyes locked onto Victoria's face. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Julian threw away a billion-dollar merger. Victoria continued. She paced slowly around the chair. "He insulted my father. He embarrassed me in front of the entire Eastern Seaboard. And for what? A woman who buys her shoes off a clearance rack." Victoria stopped in front of Clara. She reached out and grabbed a fistful of Clara's hair. She yanked her head back viciously. "Where is he?" Victoria hissed. The polished veneer cracked, revealing the ugly, desperate anger underneath. Clara swallowed the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She was terrified. She was in agony. But she remembered the lesson she had learned long before she ever met Julian Vance. Bullets kill people, but words break them. "He's not coming for me," Clara whispered. Victoria laughed. It was a harsh, brittle sound. "Of course he is. You re his little pet. You re his weakness. You really don't understand him at all, do you?" Clara said. She let a faint, mocking smile touch her cracked lips. "You think he canceled the wedding because he cares about me." Victoria frowned. Her grip on Clara's hair loosened slightly. "Julian doesn't have a heart." Victoria lied smoothly. She weaponized her own cynicisms. She played the corporate pawn perfectly. He has a ledger, and I showed him yours. Victoria went perfectly still. I showed him the offshore drops, Clara continued. Her voice gained strength. It was steady, unyielding. I showed him your father was bankrupt. I showed him you couldn't afford the caterers, let alone a private army. Julian didn't leave you at the altar for love. He left you because you're broke. You a bad investment. Victoria's face turned violently pale. The absolute truth of her family's failing finances had been her deepest, most guarded secret. To hear it spoken aloud by a bleeding assistant in a dirty warehouse shattered her ego. Shut up, Victoria snapped. She slapped Clara across the face. Hard, Clara's head snapped to the side. Her ear rang, but she turned back and looked Victoria dead in the eye. Her smile grew wider. It was a terrifying, bloody smile. You wear cashmere, Clara said softly. But you're just a beggar holding a gun. You need Julian. Julian doesn't need you. I don't need him, Victoria screamed. She lost complete control. The elegant heiress vanished. She pointed a trembling finger at Clara's face. My family's taking the ports tonight. Marcus Vance promised them to us. Clara's heart stopped. She didn't let it show on her face. She kept her breathing perfectly even. Marcus, Clara provoked, keeping her tone completely dismissive. Marcus hates your father. He would never hand over the keys to the kingdom. Victoria spat. She was desperate to prove her dominance. Desperate to prove she wasn't a pawn. He gave us the safe house codes. He gave us the override for the elite guard. Marcus is flushing Julian out. And my father's men are waiting for him at the shipyard, the pieces locked into place. It wasn't a hunt, it was a trap. Julian's wasn't running, he was coming here. He was coming to this exact shipyard to save her. And Marcus had Victoria's private army waiting to ambush him the second he stepped through the gates. Clara felt a cold, crushing weight press down on her chest. This was her second peak of despair. She hadn't just failed to escape. She was the bait. Her capture was the exact mechanism Marcus was using to execute the man she loved. Take her phone, Victoria snapped at one of the enforcers. She was breathing heavily, trying to compose herself. Check her pockets. If she sent a distress signal to Julian. I wanted to know. The enforcer stepped forward. He roughly patted Clara down. He pulled a crushed burr phone from her jacket pocket. He threw it onto the concrete and crushed it beneath his boot. She's clean, Miss Sterling. The massive man grunted. Victoria smoothed the front of her coat. She looked down at Clara with a triumphant, empty smile. Julian is walking into a firing squad, Victoria said, and when he's dead, I'm going to make a phone call to St. Jude's Hospital. Let's see how long your sister lasts when her trust fund is legally frozen. Victoria turned and walked out of the warehouse. The heavy metal door rolled down behind her. Clara was left in the dark. She closed her eyes. A single tear cut through the dirt and blood on her cheek. She was entirely helpless. But as the silence settled, she focused on her left wrist. Hidden beneath the thick plastic of the zip tie was the heavy, stainless steel watch Julian had given her for her third work anniversary. It wasn't just a watch. It was a syndicate-issue panic button. She couldn't press it. Her hands were bound, so she slowly, agonizingly twisted her wrist. She ground the face of the watch against the sharp plastic edge of the zip tie. The metal dug into her skin. She didn't stop. She twisted her wrist until the glass shattered. Until the hidden emergency beacon beneath the dial engaged. A tiny invisible pulse fired into the dark. I'm here, Julian, she thought. Don't come blindly. See the trap. Julian Vance did not kick the front door down. He was not a hero from a movie. He was a predator, and predators hunted in the dark. He crouched on the rusted catwalk high above the shipyard floor. The freezing rain lashed against his back. He looked down through the grid of the metal walkway. Victoria Sterling's men were everywhere. They had locked down the perimeter, sniper teams on the cranes, heavy gunners at the main gates. They were waiting for an assault. They expected Julian to drive an armored truck through the front entrance in a desperate bid to save his assistant. Julian pulled a small military-grade tracking monitor from his pocket. The screen glowed with a faint green light. A single red dot pulsed in the center. Clare House, Westwatch Beacon, she was alive. She was smart. She was giving him the exact coordinates. Julian holstered his Glock. He pulled a serrated tactical knife from his boot. Silence was his only advantage. He moved along the catwalk like a ghost. He dropped silently onto the roof of Warehouse 7. He bypassed the main doors entirely. He found the ventilation shaft. He kicked the rusted grate loose and slid feet first into the dark metal chute. He dropped into the rafters of the warehouse. He looked down. Clara was tied to a chair in the center of the room. She looked small, broken. The sight of her bruised face sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated rage through his veins. But he forced it down. Rage made you sloppy. Cold logic kept you alive. Two enforcers stood near the heavy roll-up door. They were smoking cigarettes. Their rifles hung casually on their slings. They were bored. They thought the trap was set outside. Julian didn't hesitate. He dropped from the rafters. He landed silently behind the first enforcer, before the man could turn. Julian clamped a hand over his mouth and drove the knife upward, directly into the base of the skull. The man went limp instantly. Julian lowered the body silently to the concrete. The second enforcer turned. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to shout. Julian threw the knife. It spun end over end, burying itself perfectly in the man's throat. He collapsed backward, hitting a stack of wooden pallets with a heavy thud. Julian walked over and retrieved his blade. He wiped it on the dead man's shirt. He moved to Clara. She looked up at him. The terror in her eyes vanished, replaced instantly by absolute, overwhelming relief. Julian pulled his knife and cut the thick plastic zip ties off her wrists. He caught her hands as they fell forward. He rubbed her wrists, restoring the blood flow. "I told you I'd come," he whispered. "It's Marcus," Clara gasped. She grabbed his shirt collar, pulling him close. Marcus set the trap. He gave Victoria the safe house keys. "He used her men to flush you out." "I know," Julian said. His voice was grim. "I saw the accounts. I know he framed me for the pension theft. But knowing it doesn't clear my name with the council. I need proof." Clara looked toward the metal door. "Victoria." She confessed to everything. "She told me Marcus promised her family the ports." Julian's eyes narrowed. The plan formulated instantly. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." She gritted her teeth and forced herself to stand. Her left leg screamed in agony, but she put her weight on Julian. They moved to the side entrance of the warehouse. Julian cracked the door, 50 yards away. Victoria Sterling was sitting in the back of an armored SUV, out of the rain. She was holding a radio, waiting for the execution order. Two guards stood outside her door. "Wait here," Julian commanded. He slipped out into the storm. He was a shadow, moving between the shipping containers. He took out the two guards with brutal, terrifying efficiency. Two suppressed shots, they dropped to the wet asphalt. Julian yanked the heavy door of the SUV open. Victoria screamed. She scrambled backward across the leather seats. Julian grabbed her by the collar of her pristine cashmere coat. He dragged her out of the vehicle and threw her onto the wet concrete. He pinned her to the ground with his boot against her chest. He drew his Glock and aimed it directly between her eyes. "Julian, please," Victoria sobbed. The arrogance evaporated. She was begging. Julian didn't shoot. He pulled his burner phone from his pocket. He hit record. "Who gave you the codes to my safe house?" Julian demanded. His voice was loud enough to cut through the rain. "Marcus," Victoria cried out. She put her hands up, shielding her face. "Marcus Vance, he gave us the codes. He told us to take the ports. He said he would train you for the pension theft. Who paid your father's mercenaries?" "We didn't pay them. Marcus paid them using your offshore accounts." "Please don't kill me." Julian stopped recording. He didn't pull the trigger. Death was too easy. He stepped off her chest. "Run back to Boston, Victoria," Julian said softly. "And if you ever look at my assistant again, I will burn your family to ash." He turned his back on her. He walked back to Warehouse 7. 30 minutes later, they were in a secure penthouse overlooking the city, a secondary safe house only Julian knew existed. Julian sat at a heavy mahogany desk. He uploaded the video of Victoria's confession directly to the Syndicate Council's secure server. The truth was out. The frame job was broken. Marcus was exposed as a traitor. Julian closed the laptop. He walked over to the leather sofa where Clara was resting. He poured 2 fingers of aged whiskey into a crystal glass and handed it to her. She took it. Her hands were still trembling slightly. "It's over," Julian said. He sat down on the coffee table directly in front of her. Clara looked at him. "The council will vote Marcus out. They'll strip his assets." "They will," Julian agreed. He leaned forward. The professional distance they had meticulously maintained for 4 years was entirely gone. He reached out and gently brushed a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "You didn't just save my empire," Julian whispered. His voice was thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. "You saved me. You showed me the rot. I don't want a secretary anymore. I want a partner." Clara looked at the man who had torn a city apart to find her. The walls around her heart finally crumbled. She leaned into his touch. They thought they had won. They thought the board was clear. On the glass coffee table, Clara's secondary burner phone buzzed. She picked it up, a text message, an unknown number. She opened it. It was a live video feed. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The whiskey glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor. The video showed a sterile white hospital room. The rhythmic hiss and click of a ventilator filled the audio. In the bed lay Maya, Clara's younger sister, unconscious, fragile, standing directly beside the bed, looking straight into the camera. Was Marcus Vance. He smiled a grandfatherly, terrifying smile. He reached out and placed his hand directly on the power cord of the ventilator. The video feed cut to black. The screen went black. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Julian didn't shout. He didn't throw the phone. He went completely still. It was the terrifying stillness of a man who had just watched his entire world catch fire. Clara couldn't breathe. The image of Marcus standing over her sister's ventilator burned into her retinas. Maya was defenseless. She was asleep. She had no idea the monster running the city's underworld was holding her life in his hands. "Julian," Clara whispered. Her voice broke. "Get your coat," Julian said. He was already moving. He didn't walk to the door. He walked to the hidden armory behind the bookshelf. He pulled out a heavy tactical vest. He strapped it over his ruined dress shirt. He grabbed a compact combat shotgun. He started stuffing extra shells into his pockets. Clara forced herself to stand. Her legs screamed, but the adrenaline drowned it out. "We need a plan. He's expecting a frontal assault." "He has my mentor's playbook," Julian said coldly. "He knows exactly how I fight. He thinks he holds all the cards." Julian tossed her a heavy Kevlar vest. Clara caught it. She strapped it over her chest. It weighed a ton, but it grounded her. They ran to the private elevator. They dropped to the underground garage. Julian bypassed his armored SUV. It was too recognizable. He threw the keys to a matte black sedan to Clara. "You drive," Julian ordered. "I need my hands free." Clara slid into the driver's seat. She hit the ignition. The engine roared. She slammed the pedal down. The sedan tore out of the garage and hit the slick, rain-soaked streets. She drove like a demon. She didn't care about red lights. She didn't care about traffic. She only cared about the clock ticking down on her sister's life. Julian pulled out his encrypted tablet. He was trying to rally the loyalists in the syndicate, the men who hadn't bought into Marcus's lies. The screen flashed red. "Damn it." Julian, his Clara, glanced over. "What?" "We are locked out." Julian tapped the screen aggressively. "The master accounts, the emergency funds, the payroll, it's all gone. Marcus just triggered a digital wipe. He froze every asset I have left. He just cut the head off the snake. Catastrophe number 1, he's starving us out," Clara said. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "If he freezes the payroll, your men won't fight for you. They'll scatter. That's exactly what he wants." Julian said. He racked the shotgun. "It doesn't matter. I don't need an army to kill one man." They crested the hill. St. Jude's Hospital loomed in the distance. It was a massive, sprawling complex of glass and steel. Clara slammed the brakes. The sedan skidded to a halt 2 blocks away. "Look," Julian said. He pointed through the windshield. The hospital was surrounded. Black SUVs blocked the emergency room entrances. Men in dark tactical gear stood at every door. They carried heavy, unsuppressed rifles. They weren't hiding. They were daring anyone to stop them. Catastrophe number 2. He locked down a civilian hospital. Clara whispered in horror. "There are sick people in there. Children. And he brought a war zone to their front door. Marcus doesn't people," Julian said bitterly. "He only sees leverage." It was the ultimate perversion of power. Holding the sick and vulnerable hostage to prove a point, Clara felt a sickening twist in her gut. She had spent her life trying to protect Maya from this exact kind of cruelty. Now it was parked right outside her window. "Maya is on the 4th floor. Her voice was pure steel. "Intensive care unit, it's a secure ward. We have to go through the underground maintenance tunnels." "Lead the way," Julian said. They abandoned the car. They moved through the shadows of the alleyways. The rain hid their approach. They reached a rusted utility grate, hidden behind a row of dumpsters. Clara remembered it from her late-night visits when she wanted to avoid the front desk. Julian pried the grate open. They dropped into the damp, echoing utility corridor. They moved fast. The tunnel was dark. It smelled of bleach and old concrete. They reached the service stairwell. "We go up 3 flights," Clara whispered. "The door opens right near the ICU control hub." Julian took the lead. He held the shotgun tight against his shoulder. He moved up the stairs with absolute, silent precision. Clara followed close behind. They reached the heavy fire door for the fourth floor. Julian held up a hand. He listened, voices, heavy boots pacing on the linoleum on the other side. 2 guards, Julian mouthed. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open. The heavy metal door slammed into the first guard. Knocking him flat, Julian leveled the shotgun. He fired once. The deafening blast echoed through the sterile hallway. The second guard dropped, his chest armor absorbing the impact. But the sheer force knocked the wind out of him. Julian stepped over the bodies. He pumped the shotgun. Move, he yelled. Clara sprinted down the hallway. Her bad leg dragged, but she pushed through the agony. She saw the heavy glass doors of the ICU ahead. Suddenly, the doors flew open. 3 of Marcus's elite guards poured out into the hallway. They raised their assault rifles. Get down, Julian roared. He shoved Clara hard against the wall. He stepped into the open corridor. He drew all their fire. The hallway erupted. The sound of automatic weapons tore through the drywall. Glass shattered, medical carts exploded. Julian fired the shotgun twice. 2 elite guards went down in a spray of blood and shattered armor. But there were too many bullets in the air. Julian jerked violently. A high-caliber round tore straight through the Kevlar near his collarbone. It hit his dominant shoulder. The force spun him around. He hit the floor hard. The shotgun slid across the bloody linoleum, out of his reach. Catastrophe number 3. Julian. Clara screamed. She scrambled across the floor. Bullets chewed the tiles around her. She grabbed Julian by the collar of his tactical vest. She dragged his heavy, bleeding body behind a reinforced nursing station counter. Julian gasped. His face was chalk white. Blood poured from his shoulder, soaking the Kevlar. His right arm hung completely useless. I'm fine, he gritted out. He reached for his sidearm with his left hand. His fingers slipped on his own blood. He couldn't hold the gun. The last elite guard was advancing down the hall slowly, methodically. Clara looked at Julian. He was bleeding out. He had taken a bullet meant for her. He had burned down his entire life, dismantled his own empire, just to get her this far. And it wasn't enough. Brute force was never going to be enough against a man who held all the cards. Clara looked at her sister's door at the end of the hall. She looked at the man bleeding on the floor beside her. She had reached the absolute peak of despair. The avalanche had finally crushed them. Julian gasped. Take my gun. Run, Clara shook her head. A strange, terrifying calm washed over her. She didn't take the gun. She stood up. She stepped out from behind the nursing station. She walked directly into the center of the hallway. She raised her hands high above her head. Don't shoot, Clara shouted. Her voice echoed clearly through the ruined corridor. I surrender. The elite guard lowered his rifle slightly. He looked confused. The door to Maya's room opened. Marcus Vance stepped out. He looked immaculate in a dark, tailored suit. He surveyed the bloody hallway. He looked at Julian, bleeding behind the counter. Then he looked at Clara, standing with her hands in the air. Marcus smiled. It was a cold, victorious smile. Well, Marcus said smoothly, I suppose that saves us some time. Clara looked at the mastermind who had tortured her. She looked at the man holding her sister's life hostage. And slowly Clara Hayes smiled back. Marcus Vance loved to win. But more than that, he loved to gloat. He waved a hand at the elite guard. Hold your fire, let her walk. Clara kept her hands raised. She walked slowly down the hallway. Her boots crunched on the shattered glass. She ignored the pain in her leg. She ignored the terrifying sight of the blood pooling around the nursing station where Julian lay. She walked straight into the ICU control hub. Marcus followed her inside. It was a glass-walled room packed with monitors tracking the vitals of every patient on the floor. Right in the center of the room was the main server rack. It controlled the hospital's localized network. You fought hard, little bird, Marcus said. He leaned against a steel desk. I have to admit, you're much smarter than Julian. He is just a blunt instrument. You actually know how to play the game. Then you know you've already lost, Clara said. She kept her voice steady. Marcus laughed. It was a rich, arrogant sound. Lost. Look around you. I own this hospital. I froze Julian's accounts. The council has named me the acting head of the syndicate. In about 5 minutes, Julian will bleed to death on that cheap floor. And your sister, Marcus, reached out. He placed a hand on the master breaker switch mounted on the wall. Your sister is a drain on resources, Marcus said coldly. She produces nothing. She consumes everything. The world is better off without people who cannot contribute. The weak are meant to be culled. It was the ultimate statement of toxic power. The complete rejection of human dignity. Clara's eyes went dark. A person's worth is not defined by what they can produce for you. A beautiful sentiment, Marcus mocked, but entirely useless. He tightened his grip on the breaker switch. Let's see how long she lasts without the backup generator. Wait, Clara cried out. She dropped to her knees. She bowed her head. She looked completely broken. She looked exactly like the helpless, defeated pawn Marcus always believed her to be. Marcus smiled. He took his hand off the switch. He wanted to savor the moment. He wanted to watch her beg. He didn't notice Clara's hand slipping into the front pocket of her Kevlar vest. Please, Clara whispered. Her head was bowed, hiding her face. Her fingers wrapped around a small, black USB drive. It was the drive she had coded back at the safe house. The one she had built while Julian thought she was just decrypting the ledger. She hadn't just prepared proof. She had built a weapon. Julian, Clara whispered, but she wasn't talking to Marcus. Out in the hallway, the bloody, dying man behind the counter moved. Julian Vance wasn't dead. He was just waiting for his cue. With a roar of pure, agonizing effort, Julian forced himself to his feet. His right arm was useless. He braced the heavy combat shotgun against his hip using his left hand. He didn't aim for Marcus. He aimed for the elite guard standing outside the glass doors. Julian pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the glass walls of the control hub. The guard was thrown backward. Alarm screamed. Marcus spun around in shock. The sudden explosion of violence shattered his perfect. Gloating victory, he reached for his own gun. That was all the distraction Clara needed. She didn't stand up. She slammed the malware USB directly into the open port of the hospital's master server rack beneath the desk. She hit the manual execute button on the drive. The LED light on the USB flashed from red to solid green. What did you do? Marcus screamed. He leveled his gun at Clara. I leveled the playing field, Clara said fiercely. On the massive monitors above them, the hospital's network didn't crash. It expanded, lines of code flooded the screens. Clara had used the hospital's unsecure local server as a backdoor to bypass Marcus's firewalls. The virus, she wrote, didn't just target the syndicate. It targeted Marcus' personal empire. Asset freeze initiated, a digitized voice announced over the computer speakers. No, Marcus shouted. He rushed the monitors. Routing funds, the computer continued. Every single offshore account Marcus had built over 40 years was draining in real time. The billions of dollars he had stolen, the pension funds he had embezzled, the mercenary contracts he had paid for. Where is it going? Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with panic. He hammered the keyboard, but he was locked out. Stop it. It's going to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Clara said softly. She stood up, she dusted off her knees. Along with a completely decrypted ledger, detailing every human trafficking ring, extortion racket, and murder for hire you've orchestrated since 1998. Marcus stared at the screens. The numbers hit zero. He was ruined. He wasn't just poor. He was a wanted man facing consecutive life sentences. The gun in his hand shook. He raised it toward Clara. His eyes were wide and mad. I'll kill you, he whispered. Drop it, a dark, rough voice commanded. Marcus froze. Julian stepped through the shattered glass doors. He was covered in blood. He was barely standing, but his left hand was perfectly steady. The barrel of his Glock was aimed directly at the center of Marcus's forehead. Marcus looked at the man he had raised, the man he had betrayed. The gun slipped from Marcus' fingers. It clattered to the floor. The great puppet master fell to his knees. Julian, Marcus pleaded. The arrogance was completely gone. He looked pathetic. He looked weak. I raised you. I made you a king. Please. You know how the feds treat our kind. Don't let them take me. Finish it here. He was begging for a bullet. He wanted a quick, clean mafia death. Julian stood over him, the cold, ruthless boss of the syndicate had every right to pull the trigger. He had every right to take his revenge. But Julian didn't look at Marcus. He looked at Clara. Julian slowly lowered his gun. He ejected the magazine and cleared the chamber. He dropped the empty weapon onto the floor. He's not my problem anymore, Julian said. He looked at the woman who had burned a corrupt empire to the ground with nothing but a keyboard and her own unyielding spirit. It's your call, Clara. He handed her the absolute authority. He recognized her as his equal. Clara looked down at Marcus, the man who had mocked her sister's life, the man who thought human beings were disposable. You don't get a quick exit, Clara said. Her voice was ice. You get to live in a cage, just like you tried to do to my family. In the distance, the wail of federal sirens pierced the night air. The FBI was coming. The trap had closed, and the mastermind was caught inside. 6 months later, the sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the new penthouse office. It was bright. It was warm. The suffocating, sterile chill of the old regime was completely gone. Clara sat behind a massive mahogany desk. She wore a tailored crimson suit that commanded the room. She was reviewing a stack of international shipping manifests. Her leg was fully healed, leaving only a faint silver scar as a reminder of the night she took down a king. The door to the office opened. Julian walked in. He looked completely different. The tense, paranoid posture of a hunted mob boss had vanished. He wore a sharp navy suit, the jacket unbuttoned. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who finally understood what it meant to breathe. "I just got off the phone with the facility," Julian said. He leaned against the edge of her desk. Clara looked up, a genuine, bright smile broke across her face. "How is she? Maya's terrorizing the physical therapy staff." Julian laughed. "She managed to walk unassisted for 20 minutes on the treadmill. The new immunosuppressants are working perfectly. She complained the food is too healthy, but the private garden is nice." Clara leaned back in her chair. A profound wave of peace washed over her. Her sister was safe. She wasn't hiding in a public ward, terrified of the bills. Maya was thriving in one of the best private recovery centers in the country. And the funding didn't come from dirty money. The syndicate had changed. The moment Marcus was arrested, Julian and Clara had purged the ranks. It was swift and brutal. They liquidated the human trafficking rings. They shut down the extortion rackets. They took the massive shipping infrastructure and pivoted it into a legitimate, high-yield global logistics company. They weren't saints. They were still ruthless business operators, but they operated under a new code. They protected the vulnerable. They paid their people fairly. And they completely destroyed anyone who tried to exploit their workforce. "The board meeting is in 10 minutes, Julian noted, glancing at his watch. "I know," Clara said. She closed the manifest folder. "But we have a guest first." The heavy double doors opened. Liam stepped inside. He was no longer just a driver. He was the head of corporate security. "Miss Vance Hayes," Liam said respectfully. "Donovan is here." Julian's jaw tightened slightly. "Send him in." Donovan was the head of a rival logistics firm in Chicago. A man who still believed business was done with threats and back-alley beatings. He walked into the office with a cocky swagger, flanked by 2 massive bodyguards. He didn't look at Julian. He walked straight up to Clara's desk and planted his hands on the mahogany. "I'm going to make this simple," Sweetheart Donovan sneered. He dripped with condescension. "Your company is undercutting my freight lines in the Midwest. I don't like it. So you're going to raise your prices by 20%. Clara didn't flinch. She just stared at him with dark, unimpressed eyes. "And if I don't?" Clara asked smoothly. "I had a chat with one of your young analysts yesterday." Donovan smiled a cruel, ugly smile. "Nice kid. Takes the red line train home every night. It would be a real shame if he had an accident on the platform. Accidents happen to people who don't play ball." The temperature in the room plummeted. Clara didn't shout. She just smiled. It was the same cold, terrifying smile she had given Marcus Vance. Julian stepped out from the shadows near the window. He moved with the silent, predatory grace that had once made him the most feared man on the eastern seaboard. He stopped right next to Donovan. Julian reached into his jacket. He pulled out his customized Sig Sauer. He slammed the heavy black metal weapon directly onto the center of Clara's desk. The sound cracked like a whip. Donovan jumped back. His bodyguards reached for their coats. But Liam already had his weapon drawn and leveled at their heads. Julian looked Donovan dead in the eye. The civilized corporate facade was gone. The monster was awake, and it was fiercely protective. "You seem confused about how this empire works now." "Donovan," Julian said softly. The whisper carried absolute authority. "Julian, be reasonable." Donovan stammered. The arrogance was gone. He looked at the gun on the desk, then at the man who owned it. "A business built on the suffering of its people is already dead," Julian quoted. He looked at Clara, repeating the lesson she had taught him in the dark. Julian turned his cold gaze back to Donovan. "We don't extort. We don't threaten families," Julian said. "But do not ever mistake our legitimacy for weakness." Julian placed his hand flat on the desk, right next to the gun. "In this empire," Julian stated, every word falling like a hammer, "you touch our people, you pay with your life. You have exactly 1 hour to get your men out of my city. If I see your face again, I won't call the police. I will handle you myself." Donovan swallowed hard. He nodded quickly, backing away toward the door. Understood, we're leaving. He turned and fled the office, his guards rushing out behind him. Liam smirked, holstered his weapon, and quietly closed the doors, leaving Julian and Clara alone. Julian picked up the gun. He cleared the chamber and locked it away in the desk drawer. He looked at Clara. You handled that well. Clara teased lightly. I had a good teacher, Julian replied. He walked around the desk. He extended his hand. Clara took it. He pulled her up from the chair. He didn't pull her into a desperate, frantic embrace like they had in the safe house. He held her close, steady and strong. An embrace of absolute equals. No toxic dominance, no power imbalance. They stood together by the window, looking out over the city they had conquered and rebuilt. Clara Hayes was no longer the invisible ghost in the machine. She was the architect of the new world. And Julian Vance was never going to let anyone tear it down. And so, the story of Julian Vance and Clara Hayes did not end with a wedding, a criminal crown, or another body left behind in the darkness. It ended with two people standing side by side before a city they had once ruled through secrecy and fear, choosing to rebuild that world under a different code. Julian began this journey believing that wealth could solve every problem, violence could every threat, and people were valuable only when they remained useful to his empire. He wore expensive suits, commanded armed men, and controlled businesses worth billions. Yet he failed to notice that the woman holding his entire organization together was living in a freezing apartment, sacrificing every dollar she earned to keep her sick sister alive. Clara was always beside him. But Julian never truly saw her until he found her bleeding on a bathroom floor, trying to stitch her own wound because she believed asking for help might place someone she loved in danger. That moment revealed one of the deepest lessons in this story. Sometimes, the people who appear strongest are carrying burdens no one has ever taken to understand. Clara did not complain. She did not demand recognition. She continued working, protecting Julian, helping injured employees, and caring for Maya while slowly destroying her own health. Her silence was not proof that she needed nothing. It was proof that she had learned not to expect anyone to care. In real life, many people around us may be fighting battles hidden behind professionalism, politeness, and quiet competence. A person can arrive on time, complete every task, and smile through every conversation while privately struggling to survive. That is why leadership and humanity must begin with attention. We should never assume that money, success, or a calm expression means someone is free from pain. Julian's transformation began when he stopped seeing Clara as an employee and finally recognized her as a human being with fears, responsibilities, boundaries, and dreams of her own. His apology mattered because he did not defend his behavior or hide behind his position. He admitted that he had failed her. But this story also reminds us that regret alone is not redemption. Real change must be proven through action. Julian protected Maya, canceled a powerful marriage arrangement, turned against the man who raised him, risked his empire, and eventually placed authority in Clara's hands. He did not rescue her merely to possess her. He learned to respect her intelligence, her independence, and her right to make her own choices. That is what separates genuine love from control. Love does not reduce someone to a weakness that must be hidden or an object that must be guarded. Real love recognizes another person as an equal. It says, I trust your strength. I respect your voice. And I will stand beside you without standing above you. Clara's strength, however, was never measured by how much pain she could endure. Her greatest power came from her mind, her courage, and her refusal to accept the cruel belief that human worth depends on productivity. Marcus viewed vulnerable people as burdens. To him, Maya's illness made her disposable. Workers' patience, and even Julian were nothing more than pieces on a board. But Clara understood that a life does not lose its value because it requires care. A sick person is not less human. A struggling worker is not a failed investment. Someone who cannot produce wealth still deserves dignity, safety, compassion, and the opportunity to live. This message reaches far beyond the world of mafia families and criminal empires. It challenges every system and every individual that measures people only by what they can provide. Clara defeated Marcus not by becoming more brutal than he was, but by attacking the foundation of his power. His empire depended on stolen money, hidden crimes, and the belief that fear made him untouchable. Clara exposed the truth and allowed justice to take what revenge never could. When Marcus begged Julian for a quick death, Julian lowered his weapon. That decision was not weakness. It was evidence that Marcus no longer controlled the kind of man Julian would become. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.